don't know whether you've enjoyed lockdown. As a family, we've actually had quite a good time. We've had some good times together, but I've had a chance to do some DIY, and I love doing the DIY. Now, one job I had to do that I didn't really enjoy was cleaning out the attic, okay? And for those of you maybe watching online, you might be thinking, yeah, my attic's a mess. Well, I had to tidy it for two reasons. First one was that my wife Kathy had been telling me for 2 years you need to tidy the attic, and that was really the pressing thing. The second one was that it was just an absolute state, and the way it got that way is that we've got two little kids, and kids were out of prams and cots and baby baths and clothes, and so I'd go up to the attic and just put them in. But as you get tired when you've got little kids and you've got more stuff, the putting in kind of becomes a bit more throwing in. And a bit like a volcano that keeps spreading out as more lava comes up, it was a bit like my attic was becoming like a volcano as I got to the stage where I couldn't even put it over the pile. I had to throw it to the far side, and so it was a stage. So Kathy wanted me to tidy it, and I was also conscious we need to get rid of some stuff and we needed to sell a few things as well. So here's the highlight of what I found, and there's a picture of it. It's a 1920s antique mahogany toilet seat. Now, here's why that was there. Like I took the pram and thought, might need it later. Some stage, decades before in our house, someone had taken off a toilet seat and thought, might need it later, throw it in the attic. Now, I'm delighted about this. I looked at it, I thought, there's money in this. Kathy said, throw it in the bin. I said, no, there's money to be had. I cleaned it up, I put some wax on, it sold for £240. There is money in antique toilet seats. So, that was one of my eBay successes, the best I've ever had. But I've also had some disasters. Here's my worst disaster on eBay. I went to the North Face shop at Cheshire Oaks, and they had some trousers reduced from £50 down to £5. I thought, yes, there's money to be made in that. But they were orange. I thought, still, there's money to be made. I bought 10 pairs. Put them on. There's a reason they didn't sell. They're orange. So that was an absolute disaster I had on eBay. Now, the reason I'm talking about eBay is there's actually quite a few ways you can cheat on eBay. And I'm going to tell you a few of those ways you can cheat, okay? So first of all, if you're selling something like a pram, which I've just done recently, what you can do is you can list it and you can talk about all the great features, but you might then actually just miss out all the negatives. So someone might get this pram and you've not said the fact that the wheels are all worn, the material's faded, it's all scuffed, but they've bought it now and there's not enough justification to say, well, I want a refund. So that's one way people can be quite selective in some of the weaknesses of the pram, or whatever you're selling. The second way people, and you're able to cheat eBay, is when you've sold the item, and let's say you've sold a pram for £100, what you can do is when the person comes, you can say to them, look, don't pay through eBay, because eBay take a 10% cut, give me cash in hand, and I can go away with 10% more, so that £100 has stayed £100 rather than being 90. So these are two ways in which you can cheat eBay, and the truth is there's many other ways that people abuse as well. Now it's important at this stage before we go any further, I am not one of those eBay cheats, you'll be delighted to hear. When I sold our pram, I made sure I did talk about some of the weaknesses, and it did mean I made a little bit less money on it, but it meant I could give that away knowing that they've got a good deal, I've got a good deal. And also, when you sell the items, I make sure eBay gets the cut. And I tell you what, it's sometimes difficult when someone's collected something off me, or I was buying it off someone and they said, look, give me cash and then I'll cancel the sale and then I get all the money. And so there's always a temptation to think, that £100, do I want it to become 90 and let eBay take the cut? Well, I do make sure that eBay get their cut. And I do this because I'm trying my best to be holy in all things. And I emphasise the word try because I'm not perfect like any of us. I do sometimes make a real mess of things, but the whole thing about being God's people is that you try to follow God's word. But the good thing is God has abundant grace and forgiveness for us when we do make a mess of things. And so today, what I want to do is I want to look that as God's people, how are we called to be holy? not just on eBay, it's not an eBay sermon, but how do we be holy in all areas of our lives? So what does it mean to be holy? And I've got a video that might make you laugh.
So what does the word holy mean?
Got it. The word holy means full of holes, as in, my socks are very holy. I used it in a sentence and everything.
Yes, you did.
That's a different kind of holy. Pastor Paul, can you help us out?
The word holy means dedicated to or set apart for God. To be holy is to be set apart for God.
I set apart these mashed potatoes to eat later. They are holy.
No, Captain Pete, that isn't quite right. To be holy, something must be set apart for God. Those mashed potatoes are for you. That might make them yummy, but it doesn't make them holy.
Sorry, potatoes.
So there you go. We've found out what the definition of holy is, and I love the fact that Pastor Paul is actually, if you notice, playing on the piano as he defines holiness. So when God told Israel to be holy in Leviticus, what he was doing is he was instructing them to be distinct from other nations, to be separate, and by giving specific regulations to govern their lives the way God wanted them to live. So Israel is God's chosen nation, and God had set them apart from all other people groups. So what it is they are a special people, and consequently they have been given a set of standards that God wants for them to live by, that is higher, that is different to the world in which they belong. And when Peter repeats the Lord's words in 1 Peter 1 verse 16 on the slide, he said he is talking specifically to believers. It says, for the scriptures say you must be holy because I am holy. And you see, as believers, we need to be set apart from the world as Christians. We need to be living by God's standards. So what we're going to look at today, that is a promise and a commandment to the Israelites, also applies exactly to us, because we are God's chosen people, we are Christians. And the key thing here is God isn't calling us to be perfect, but to be distinct from the world. None of us can follow the commandments perfectly, and that's why Jesus' grace and mercy and his blood is the key thing that keeps us as God's people. Now, there are many passages we could look at throughout the Old Testament, in the New Testament, in terms of how are God's people to be holy? How are they to be set apart? And I've taken a scripture that you've probably never necessarily heard taught on in this context. And what it is, it's 1 Samuel chapter 8. Now, if that seems familiar, you'll remember from last time I preached, it was 1 Samuel chapter 7. And what I want to do in the weeks and months ahead as I preach is I want to try and work through 1 and 2 Samuel so that you get an understanding of those stories and the narratives, but also so that we can take applicable things. So what we'll do is we'll go on a journey and you'll find applicable things whilst getting the full picture of 1 and 2 Samuel. So let me give you a really short recap, because Kathy, who was trained and works as a teacher, the key thing she tells me about teaching is it's about repetition. So I'm just going to jog your memory from 3 weeks ago, very briefly. So we look at the scripture, which is the last verse that we looked at, which was 1 Samuel 7, verse 12. It said, after the victory, Samuel took a large stone and placed it in between the towns of Mizpah and Jeshna. He called Ebenezer, which means the stone of help, for he said, up to this point, the Lord has helped you. And what I did was I encouraged you to have an Ebenezer stone, and what that would do is that would be in your life to remind you how God delivered you yesterday, and that he's the same God that delivered you yesterday. He's the same God who can deliver you today. And sometimes the only way we can remember this is to look back in our lives, look at those Ebenezer moments to see God was at work then and he's still at work. If you've missed that message, it's again on YouTube, you can check that out. and it would be great for you to kind of catch up with the bits you have missed. So, today's message, we carried on, like I said, the story of Samuel. Now, Samuel, like all the other judges before him, followed a cycle. It was a very, very set, fixed cycle. And here's what happens. God raises up a judge, in this case Samuel, before him Eli, and so on and so on. So the judge is raised up to deliver his people and rule over them in peace. And the judge would lead Israel, bringing peace throughout his lifetime. But then when the judge died, the people returned to their sin. And so the cycle begins again. So let's look at our passage today. So what I'll do is I'm taking the last 3 verses of chapter 7, which just kind of puts into context where we go on, because there's quite a jump, quite a few decades between the end of chapter 7 and chapter 8. So, and you'll see these on the screen. So the Philistines were subdued and didn't invade Israel again for some time. And throughout Samuel's lifetime, the Lord's powerful hand was raised against the Philistines. So, decades pass. As Samuel grew old, he appointed his sons to be judges over Israel, Joel and Abijah. His older sons, held court in Beersheba. But they were not like their father. Again, remember, there's that kind of cycle. They were not like their father, for they were greedy for money. They accepted bribes and perverted justice. Finally, all the elders of Israel met at Ramah to discuss the matter with Samuel. Look, they told him, you are now old and your sons are not like you. Give us a king to judge us like all the other nations have. Samuel was displeased with their request and went to the Lord for guidance. Do everything they say to you, the Lord replied. For they're rejecting me, not you. They won't want me to be their king. They don't want me to be their king any longer. Ever since I brought them from Egypt, they have continually abandoned me and followed other gods. And now they are giving you the same treatment. Do as they ask, but solemnly warn them about the way a king will reign over them. And again, because I'm going through this and trying to kind of teach a bit more of the story of Samuel, that's why I'm picking scriptures that are a little bit longer, so we can take you on that journey. So Samuel passed on the Lord's warning to the people who were asking him for a king. This is how a king will reign over you, Samuel said. The king will draft your sons and assign them to his chariots and his charioteers, making them run before his chariots. Some will be generals and captains in his army, some will be forced to plough in his fields and harvest his crops, and some will make his weapons and chariot equipment. The king will take your daughters from you and force them to cook and bake and make perfumes for him. And he will take away the best of your fields and vineyards and olive groves and give them to his own officials. He will take a tenth of your grain and your great harvest and will distribute it among his officials and attendants. He will make your male and female slaves and demand your finest of your cattle and donkeys for his own use. He will demand a tenth of your flocks and you will be his slaves. And when that day comes, you will beg for relief from the king you are demanding, but then the Lord will not help you. And this is the bit that is just mind-blowing. But the people refused to listen to Samuel's warning. Even so, they still want a king. They said, we want to be like the nations around us. Our king will judge us and lead us into battle. So Samuel repeated to the Lord what the people had said, and the Lord replied, do as they say and give them a king. Then Samuel agreed and sent the people home. I mean, that's ridiculous, isn't it? Yeah. I mean, I read that in its full breadth, just to kind of say, oh, it's not that things will be tough. Things will be horrendous. You'll be begging God to remove this king, so you don't want him, do you? Yeah, we do. We do want him. So, just ridiculous. So, in and of itself, to actually ask for a king was not bad. Because the Israelites would have understood that God, about 400 years previous, had given instructions to Israel about their future king. And this is all leading to David and, the whole line that would lead to Christ. And so this is recorded in Deuteronomy 17, 14 to 20. And so If a king is God's plan for Israel, then why, when the Israelites asked for a king, did God see it as a personal rejection? Because if you left it there, you think, oh, why is God saying that? It seems reasonable. You've said this has happened. They want it to happen. But what we're going to do is look at 3 reasons why Israel wanted a king. And the first one is Samuel's sons were not fit to lead Israel. They were taking bribes. And that was clearly forbidden, what we saw from Eli's sons, last time I spoke, and throughout the whole Bible. And so the story of Eli is being repeated. Eli had 2 corrupt sons, and so Israel was instead ruled by Eli's adopted son, Samuel. And now Samuel's sons are corrupt, and the people don't like what's happening. So, is that a good reason that the people should ask for another king? Well, I would say the answer is yes. That seems like a really good reason. The guy in charge, or the guys in charge, are corrupt. We want rid of them. So far, first reason, okay, it seems reasonable that the Israelites want a new king. Second one, the 12 tribes of Israel are continually fighting against each other. They have a lot of problems, so they fight other nations, but there's always bickering amongst themselves. You see, each tribe had its own leader and its own territory, and there was just a lot of kind of bickering between them. And it was hoped that a king would unite the tribes into one nation, one army, that this would fix the bickering. So is that a good reason? It sounds like a good reason, but it's not. Okay? It's not a good reason. And let me tell you why. So it looks good on the face of it, but the reality is the request that they have actually amounts to a rejection of God's rule. It reflects a failure to trust in God's power to save his people. See, they did not trust God. They wanted a king that they could see. They wanted to live by sight and not by faith. I can see the king, he's sitting on the throne, he's going to protect us. I'm okay with that. That will bring me security. But by doing that, they're rejecting the one and only God and saying, actually, we prefer a physical person rather than you. So actually, while it looks a good reason, it's not. It's a rejection. And then our third reason they wanted a king. And this is really the gist of the sermon. This is where I'm going to spend some minutes now. The people wanted to be like their neighbouring nations. You see, this is exactly what God didn't want. The people are not asking for the king God promised those 400 years ago. They're trying to force God's hand, and they're asking for a king like all the other nations had. So all the other nations, and all the other nations around Israel, we know, were not following God. They were not God's chosen people. So in effect, by saying we want to follow the nations, they're completely saying we're going to reject God, and we want what we think is better what the other nations have. See, Israel was called to be, and this is an important word, unlike. The very opposite of what they want. To be unlike the nations because they were called to be like God. But now they want to be like the nations rather than God. You see, Israel were the people of God. At the heart of the covenant with God was this promise, which is in Exodus 6:7. I will take you as my own people, and I will be your God. They were a special people with a special relationship with God. Only they could say, he is our God. Other nations couldn't. I found this, it's a bit annoying with Eve, who's now 2. And she's got into the habit of calling me James. And it drives me crazy, but she's not quite got the comprehension at the moment to say, no, you call me Dad, you can't call me James. And I went through the same thing with Alice. And what I tell Eve, like I told Alice, is look, you and Alice are the only 2 who can say, I'm your dad. And as such, you get to use the word dad, father. Everyone else calls me James. but you have a special use. So if she doesn't understand that yet, she will. She better, because I won't allow it. It's disrespectful. Right, yeah, so they're a special people. They've got a special relationship with God, and they are called to be a light to the other nations. See, in other words, they had a missional identity. And what do I mean by that? What I mean is they were to be like God so that they could reveal God to the nations. And now they just want to be like all the other nations, and it's completely overturning who they are. So the Israelites asked Samuel for a king, thinking that a new system of government would fix all the problems they had. But because the basic problem was disobedience to God, they weren't fixing anything. They were going to have the same problems, and then heaped up a load of more struggles, is that you're now turning away from God. A new administration won't fix it. A bit like when it comes to the elections in the States, or when we look for our elections in the UK. The next party can have some change, but you can't, in November, have a new president who then just comes in and says, bang, here's my plan, I'll get it fixed in a year. We've got the virus, we've got a massive, loss of earnings. That is not going to fix it. It might help, but it's not going to fix it. But in this situation, having a new authority, a new power, did the reverse. It didn't help at all, it caused more problems. So the Israelites had submitted to God's leadership. If they had, they would have thrived beyond their expectations. And if we look at Deuteronomy 28, if you fully obey the Lord your God and carefully keep all his commands that I'm giving you today, the Lord your God will set you high above all the nations of the world.
Praise God.
It's clear. You're going to get blessed, and I'll come a bit more into that blessing a little bit later on. But the Israelites decide to reject God's blessing and follow the influence of the other ungodly nations. Now, we've all been influenced by others and ended up making some bad decisions, haven't we? Let me tell you about a bad decision I made. I used to be part of a church where the pastor was quite a trendy, snappy dresser. And one time he got pointy shoes. Anyone over the age of 50 will probably call them winkle pickers. And so I thought, he looks pretty cool, he's a good guy, I'm going to get some pointy shoes. Now, they were an absolute disaster. Because of the point, when you walk, you go heel to toe. So you go toe to heel, I think, do you?
Yeah, I have this one.
Can't quite. Anyway, but what it was doing is because the length of my foot had gone to here, I was having to change the whole way I was walking. And it was a disaster. And here's the worst, is the office I worked in at my church was at the top of some steps. But it was a staircase that should have been that wide that was squashed like this. So the steps were super steep. Now, what happens when you walk up super steep steps with long pointy shoes? You keep clipping the top of the step. And I can't tell you the number of times I fell over on those steps. So that was not a good example of me being influenced by someone else. Now, obviously, that's a joking one that, that's not really affected my life a great deal. But there are plenty of examples in our lives of how we can let the values and actions of others dictate our values and behaviour that leads to a real negative outcome. Let me give you 4 things to just make it applicable to us. So you go out with your friends for a night and you go for a drink. And you have a drink, you have 2, but they keep drinking. And you think, I know I shouldn't get drunk, but they're having such a good time. Go on, I'll have a 3rd, a 4th, a 5th. You end up completely drunk. Is this being holy and set apart?
No.
Next one. It's the end of the financial year, you're working a sales job. And you've got to compile your sales figures to submit to your boss so he can do his report to his boss and boss and boss and so on. And your colleagues around you, what they've done is they've rounded the figures up a little bit. It makes them look better, it leads to their boss being happier with them, and they probably get a bigger bonus. And you think, well, if I don't do that, I'm going to look like I'm behind the pack, and I'm going to get in problems. So you falsify your figures, you just round them up a little bit. Is that being holy and set apart?
No.
Another one, you're at work and your work colleagues, they swear a lot and they tell jokes, but they are crude and they're offensive. But you just get used to it and actually you start joining in and all of a sudden you're laughing and telling your own jokes. Is that being holy and set apart? Final one, TV. There's loads of great stuff on TV, but there's a lot of stuff that is rubbish, that's really bad in the content. And there's certain content that each of us is going to find more challenging in terms of how it affects us. But largely, if we've got a film or a TV series that's an 18 that's full of swearing, that's full of sex, that's full of violence, is that going to be to keep us holy and set apart?
No.
But the thing is, there's always that temptation to watch it. And we just think, everyone's talking about this series, I've got to watch it. If I don't watch it, I'll be left behind. So, we need to be careful that the values of our unbelieving friends and in the media, and particularly when we look at celebrities, don't pull us away from what God says is right.
Exactly.
You see, when God's people want to be like unbelievers, they're on a slippery slope heading for spiritual disaster.
And the Prime Minister as well.
And the Israelites were supposed to be a nation whose behaviour was governed by God's ruling word, but instead their behaviour was now being governed by what other people did. They were supposed to be distinct, different and holy, and instead they wanted to be the same, to conform and to fit in. They were supposed to be the light to all nations, revealing the truth of God's rule, but instead of the nations learning from Israel, Israel was learning from the nations. And so the church today is called to have a distinctive missional identity. And let me just again focus a little bit in a different way what missional means. It means we are to adopt a life of thinking, of behaviours and practices that show other people what the gospel is. To be missional is to be like Christ. It's to take Christ out into the world to lead by example.
Yeah.
Whereas the Israelites were doing the opposite. They weren't leading by example, they were following the example of those on their own path. And Peter uses this language of Israel's identity to describe the identity of the church. And it's in 1 Peter 2 verse 9 it says, "But you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light." So Peter says that we as the church are the inheritors of Israel's status as God's chosen people. So as God's chosen people, we are to be holy and set apart. And here's the best bit. When we are set apart as God's people, we get the blessing that the Israelites got. And I've saved this now for the rest of it. And again, this is probably around sort of 10 verses. But I'm doing this because I want to contrast the horrendous list of how the people were going to get abused by a king to what the blessing is. I didn't want to give a summary, I wanted to read it out. So, if you fully obey the Lord your God and carefully keep all his commands that I'm giving you today, the Lord your God will set you high above all the nations of the world. You will experience all these blessings if you obey the Lord. Your towns and your fields will be blessed. Your children and your crops will be blessed. The offspring of your herds and flocks will be blessed. Your fruit baskets and breadboards will be blessed. Wherever you go and whatever you do, you will be blessed. The Lord will conquer your enemies when they attack you. They will attack you from one direction, but they will scatter from you in 7. The Lord will guarantee a blessing on everything you do and will fill your storehouses with grain. The Lord your God will bless you in the land he is giving you. If you obey the commands of the Lord your God and walk in his ways, the Lord will establish you as his holy people, as he swore he would do. Then all the nations of the world will see that you are a people claimed by the Lord, and they will stand in awe of you. Now that is a blessing, isn't it? I mean, we talk about, we think of someone, we say, yeah, God's blessings. I mean, how many times have we done that? Oh, God's blessings on you. Well, I'll tell you what, if we said, right, God's blessings on you, and they are, and read that out, we'd have a different understanding. We'd have a different way we would walk. We would be walking in confidence and boldness, knowing that God has got an amazing blessing for us. Now, as I close, I want to put 3 statements to you, and I want to put a challenge to each of these statements. And they're quite weighty, I won't lie. There is some real depth behind them, and it's not something you can just quickly think about now and move on. And when the service is finished, I've got kind of a brief outline of what I've been sharing, but I've also got these questions and the challenges, and I'd ask you to take them in your quiet time with God, just you and God. Actually, just open your heart and say, God, would you minister to me? Would you actually really speak to me? And would you actually tell me where I've drifted, where I've not been putting you as number one, I've been looking for other people or other influences that aren't good. So here are the questions which should come up. So number 1, we are to be a people whose behaviour is governed by God's ruling word. Are we? I'm not looking for you to answer this, because in certain areas, I think as a whole we'll be thinking yes, but there'll be bits that God will speak to you where you realise no. Not as a blanket no, but there'll be bits where I'm like, oh yeah, that part I've not. Number 2, we are to be different, distinct and holy. Are we? Well, on the whole, probably. But what about those examples when you're in work? Does your behaviour slip a little bit? Do you sell something on eBay and think, well, no one knows, I'll take that commission? And number 3, we are supposed to be a light to the nations, declaring the praises of him who calls out of darkness into his wonderful light. So are we being missional? Can people see our life, our actions, listen to our words and think, I see Jesus there? Now for that one, we can all definitely say yes, but a lot that's no. Because we strive to imitate Christ, but we never get there because we're human. So those 3 questions I want you to take away, I want you to think through, and just let God minister to your heart and say, God, what are my weaknesses? What do I need to work on? I'm going to pray, and then once I've prayed, we're going to have a closing song. And again, this is on the similar thing we've already been singing about, to be holy and set apart. And what I would say is, just make use of your hands. Maybe stand up, open your hands, and just say, I want to be set apart. Would you speak to me, God? So I'll just pray. God, I thank you that as your people, you have called us to be holy and to be set apart. And God, we want that blessing. We want that blessing that comes with being your people who are holy and set apart. And so, God, I just pray before I ask for a blessing, God, I pray that we would be people that would have the humility and the vulnerability to say, God, would you search me? Would you search my heart? And would you show me what needs to change? So that I can be missional in my identity, that I can share your good news with people. And God, when we're doing that, God, we want you to bless us abundantly. We want you to bless our socks off, God. And not so we can just keep hold of that blessing, so that we can be a blessing to our family, our friends, our church, the unsaved. Bless us so that we may be a blessing, I pray, God. In your name. Amen.
Purify my heart. Let me be as gold and precious silver. Purify my heart. Let me be as gold, pure. Refiner's fire, and my heart's one desire is to be holy, set apart for you, Lord, and I choose to be holy, set apart for you, my master, ready to do your will. Purify and purify my heart. Cleanse me from within. Lord, make me holy. Lord, purify my heart. Cleanse me from my sin. Deep within, and refiner's fire. It's my heart's one desire. It is to be holy, set apart for you, Lord, and I choose to be holy, set apart for you. I choose, and I choose to be holy, Lord, set apart for you, Lord, and I choose to be holy, oh, set apart for you, my master. You're ready to do your will. Ready, ready to do your perfect will. I'm ready, God, I am willing to do your will, no matter what the cost, no matter what the cost. No matter what it takes, Lord, no matter what may come, no matter what may come, Lord, I'm ready, Lord God, I'm so ready to do your will, just to do your will. And I choose to be holy, set apart for you, Lord. And I choose to